Okay, I think we'll get started. So hello to everyone and welcome to the 2022 Intellectual Property Speaker Series presented by the MIT Technology Licensing Office and MIT Libraries. Today's session is titled Developing Industry-Sponsored Research Agreements. My name is Michael Lescue, an OSAT Alliance Manager, and I will be your moderator today. Each panelist will introduce themselves as we move through the presentation. If you are an attendee, please note that you are muted and your video is off. Registration is still open for the other sessions in our series. You can follow the link that I've posted in the chat to reserve your spot in these other webinars. During the webinar, the Q&A is the best way to communicate with either the speaker or with any of the panelists. As the moderator, I will be monitoring this. Please post your questions and comments in the Q&A section and watch for other questions you find interesting. Questions with the most upvotes will be prioritized. Thank you and enjoy the webinar. And with that, I'm going to share screen so that we can get started. Bear with me now. This is the moment of truth for anyone who's presenting, right? So here we go. Again, this is the Intellectual Property Speaker Series. And today's session is developing industry-sponsored research agreements. So to get us started, I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Leah Keating, who will tell us a little bit about OSAT and RAS. Leah, over to you.
I feel like I'm on the news. Thank you, Michael. Welcome to everybody who's joined. Thank you for spending time with us this afternoon. As Michael said, my name is Leah Tenney Keating, and I have recently joined OSAT this fall, and I wanted to speak with you a little bit about the introduction to OSAT and part of a little bit about my role before I turn it over to Grace for some more detail, and further on through the presentation about developing industry-sponsored research agreements. So this first slide we thought was nice for context setting because this is this depicts OSAT and RAS, which are two offices that work closely together to support faculty at MIT. So OSAT is a recently formed office that is focused primarily on industry engagements, which is industry-sponsored research agreements, membership and consortia agreements. And we are, as this shows, closely connected to RAS to provide these coordinated services for MIT investigators. As I said, Grace, who's my colleague at least in my screen, she's one down from me, but she's going to go through a little bit more about the specific roles that we have in the OSAT core, which you see over on the left middle. But just to say that part of my role personally is as a RAS liaison from OSAT core. So in that capacity, I'm the primary point of contact between RAS and OSAT core for process and workflow. And that's part of what, what I'm focused on is making sure that these offices support faculty very well in with research endeavors. So please don't hesitate to reach out. And with that, I will turn it to Grace, and you'll hear from me. Sorry, you'll hear from me more a little bit later about crafting agreements. But for now, I'll turn to Grace to talk about our roles in a bit more detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. My name is Grace Lang, and I'm one of the catalysts in the Office of Strategic Alliance and Tech Transfer. I have a science background in molecular biology and microbiology, and after that, I have worked in capacity in business development and licensing in other university tech transfer offices. So today I want to tell you more about the story of OSAT, why it was formed, and how can we help you. So many of us are attracted to MIT because of its great innovation spirit. Fun facts. In the MIT mission statement, it's actually talk about we all want to work with others to bring knowledge to bear on the world's greatest challenges. So industry engagement has been in the DNA of MIT. And OSAT, Office of Strategic Alliances and Tech Transfer, is a big umbrella organization within MIT to support MIT faculty in the entire innovation process, which is depicted in this big arc. When I'm talking to researchers about what our role is, I want to think about it in a way of the innovation process, which starts from the original idea formation, like what kind of real world problem we want to solve and how to solve it. And it goes to the part of research, actually doing the research, and also before that, formalizing the research, collaboration, engagement with a partner. And then the last part is after you've finished the research, there might be new knowledge and also perhaps new invention that come out from the research project. And how do we bring that fruit of research to the real world to inflict a global impact? And OSAT is a one-stop shop, as the title depicted, for industry research partners and IP licenses. So let me start from the left to the right. It's according to this great arc of innovation process. OSATs have two traditional offices. On the left, the Office of Corporate Relations. So they are a team of professionals who work really hard to bring industry partners to MIT to work with our faculty to solve real world problems. I'm sure like some of our colleagues from the Industry Liaison Program and the MIT Startup Exchange are here in the audience today. Feel free to say hi over the Q&A. But if you haven't got a chance to go to one of their conferences, please do so, and it's great. So they bring in businesses interested into MIT. And when we look at the far right-hand side of the slide, we have the technology licensing offices. They are the office who move innovations and discovery from the lab to the marketplace through protecting IP, licensing, and startup formation. So the new function we have added in the last 2 years is in the middle. We call it the OSAT core, which comprise of 3 functions. The Catalyst, which is where my team is located. So wave a little bit, Subhana and myself. Leah Keating, who is in the strategic transaction team, who is in the middle of the OSAT core, and also alliance managers, which Michael is belonging. So the Catalyst, starting back from the left, scientists and PhDs who have business and licensing experience. We serve as a bridge between the lab and the industry partner so that we can help our professors and the company to align their expectations when we are formulating collaboration engagements. We also, the Catalyst also works side by side with strategic transaction team who are legal experts in crafting tailor-made sponsored research agreements, so that together we form a team to translate MIT industrial collaboration ideas into clear and coherent agreements. My teammates in the Alliance Managers team, they are master communicator and expert project managers who are focusing on post-deal management. So they take care of the project once it's running and to connect with the sponsor for long-term relation. They mostly work on multi-year and complicated projects. Michael Lesku here today, he will talk more about that function later. So with that, with the entire innovation process been taken care of under one roof, we hope as a team, OSAT can help our professors and faculty to achieve their ultimate goal of moving innovation to the real world. So with that, I'll forward the ball to Michael Lesku, who will tell you more about how OSAT core works from another angle. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Grace. And for our attendees, one quick note about what we're going to go through for the rest of the presentation. This will be the last slide of our introduction. And after that, we're going to transition to talk you through what we do. So we're still telling you here for this slide a little bit about what we are. But really the goal of this is to try to bring a little bit of clarity about how we can specifically help researchers and the departments and administrators who support them. Our mission is to be faculty-centric, which is to say that we want to put the research first and then figure out how we can help in areas where we can be helpful. Grace has already talked you through the process for how a good idea becomes an agreement and we hope changes the world. There's one graphic that I want to draw your attention to here. We like to think of as our virtuous circle or virtuous cycle. And the main point of this is if we step back, what we see is that our research isn't just a single project that goes from an idea to its execution and performance and then it ends. What we really want with the companies that we interact with are relationships. We want to work with them over and over again for decades, for hundreds of years, right? And not just a particular researcher, not just a particular department. We know that our engagements with some of our most important industrial friends span across multiple departments, multiple schools, even to the entire institute. So one of the reasons why OSAT was created was to get a better handle on these agreements. And whereas in the past, we might have asked a department, we would have said, hello, department administrator, you have an agreement with this company. We want you to manage the relationship with all of the agreements that this company has across all of MIT. And that can be a lot. So having a central office with that visibility really gives us the chance to look at this holistically. So although we're going to talk you through how a particular agreement, how a particular idea can become a research project, please keep in the back of your head that we're also talking about this broader picture about how MIT engages with companies throughout the United States and around the world. One last plug before I hand it off one more time. Please do ask questions. The most important way that this webinar can be helpful is if you ask as many questions as you can. Tell us about what's worked in the past at MIT. Tell us about what you would like to know about how OSAT can help you and your department. Whatever you ask us here, if it's too specific, we might take it offline, but we are here to help and we want to make this as productive for you as we can. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Grace, who will start to take us through a particular idea through its execution so that we can see how this will actually work in practice. So Grace, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. So here, OSAT Catalyst is your navigator. How so? So I'll say OSAT Catalyst will be the point person for both internal and external stakeholders when the faculty and the company start to have conversation about interest in working together. So the catalysts say if you're researchers, after you initially talk to a company, I think that would be a great time to engage with a catalyst so that we can help you to work with the company to ascertain the nature of the engagement. Will that collaboration be a two-way collaboration? Is it a really funded project? The catalyst will ask both you and the company set of questions to ascertain the nature of the engagement. Next, we'll work with the faculty member to work on an early draft of statement of work. My colleague Subhana Basnet will talk about the statement of work development later on in the process. In addition to statement of work, we also work with other central offices within OSAT and outside of OSAT, which are related to agreement development. For example, we work really closely with the technology licensing officers at TLO to help us to identify any background intellectual property that is related to the proposal. So the idea is that we want the faculty member and also the company understand how this sponsored research projects sit within the a bigger picture of the PI's intellectual property portfolio and their longer term commercialization strategies. For example, will the PI wanted to start a company in the future from the work that is starting from this collaboration. Also, we coordinate and bring on board a strategic transaction officers. As earlier, I've said that the STOs, a legal expert who can draft custom-made sponsor research agreement according to the needs of both the faculty and the sponsor. The CALUS also coordinate with our colleague from Research Administration Services, RAS, to ensure that there's a smooth and timely compliance process, which my colleague Leah Keating will talk more about later. We also coordinate with the lab administrator or the department's financial officers to make sure that there is a smooth setup and approval of KC proposals and also the budget. Most importantly, during all these coordination, we keep the faculty and the sponsor, the company, appraised of the progress in negotiation. And we also participate with the STO, our contract experts, in agreement negotiation with the company. So if you are researchers, the next topic will be of particular interest to you. My colleague, Subarna Basnet, also a CALUS, will tell you more about the first step of developing the statement of work. Hand it over to you.
Grace, just before Subarna takes over, could I ask, we have a question from the audience. The question is, does each department, lab, or center have a dedicated catalyst?
The quick answer is not yet. So far we have a team of 5 CALUS, but we roughly categorize ourselves into different domain expertise. So for example, my area is in life sciences. Subarna's areas is in engineering. We also have a CALUS who covers the computer AI space. So if you reach out to us, later on we'll show you the general email address. Your request will be allocated according roughly to our domain expertise.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt. Subarna, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Grace. So I'm Subarna Basnet. I'm a relatively new catalyst. I joined this OSAT group about 6 months ago, just over 6 months ago. I used to work at MIT International Design Center as a director for design science, technology and innovation. I've been with MIT for the last, I would say, almost 11 years now. Before that, I've been in the industry for most of my life. With my last stint with Bose Corporation as a mechanical design engineer. Here, what I'll do today is to cover primarily the statement of work, what is involved in developing that, and what should you be considering that in order to develop a proper one, as well as what additional information do we as Catalyst seek from you so that it provides a good preparation for the STOs to draft a customized agreement. So let's start with the statement of work. So once you start as a researcher, for example, or a PI, once you start talking to a sponsor, one of the important things that you'll be working on is developing a statement of work that defines what the research is going to be. In order to develop a proper SOW, it's important to understand a few, I would say, broad broad ideas. One of the first one is to understand the fact that industries sponsors at MIT can only fund basic and applied research that is intended to advance science and science for the public good. So the two key ideas is advancing science as well as for the public good. So one of the ideas that's very helpful to understand this is the technology readiness level some of you might be aware of. So anything that's, say, for example, TRL level from 1, 3, 4, or 5 might qualify as basic and applied research. 1 and 2 definitely qualifies as basic research, whereas 3 and 4 will be more like applied research. Once you get into, let's say, for example, 6 or 7, more like upscaling of, for example, any device that you have to develop, for example, would probably not qualify as part of applied research. In that such a case, it might not be qualified to be funded by the sponsor. And the other thing is the same idea goes back to the advancing science also. So if you are working on basic and applied science, that means you are engaged in advancing science, not just developing technology or designing something for the sponsor. The next important point to consider is the fact that MIT researchers and faculties cannot engage in contract research. What that means is that the relationship that you have with the sponsor is not that of a vendor and a service provider. It's a vendor and a customer. So here you're not, the sponsor are not your customer, and we are not suppliers either. So what we are doing is, as a researcher, we are conducting research for the public good, and the sponsor is there to fund that research as a sponsor, not as a customer. That's a very important distinction to be made. So the next point is the statement of work is a proposal from the MIT lab to the sponsor. It's the MIT's proposal. It's not a work order from the sponsor to the MIT lab. Again, a very important distinction. So that also means that because your proposal is your proposal at MIT's lab, that means you get to direct the research, not the sponsor. So, however, that doesn't mean that you come up with a proposal out of the blue and then expect to be funded. This is different from NSF, for example. What you do is you typically consult the sponsor. Typically, the research based on a problem identified by the sponsor, for example. You discuss together and you come up with a research plan that is of interest. Again, in that case, a lot of times, one of the things that we see is that industries typically like less risky projects, which means they want to fund something that is at TRL level 6 or 7, for example, but at the same time, it's not going to qualify as basic or applied research. And the other aspect is a lot of times the MIT PIs like to work on 1 and 2 TRL level technologies, for example, very early research, which can be seen as very risky for the industry. So you have to find a sweet spot where both the parties are interested and find it interesting to work in the problem. Because the proposal, SOW is a proposal from the MIT lab, what that also means is that the MIT PI and the researchers get to direct it. But that doesn't mean that you're not responsible or you don't need to be responsive to the sponsor at all. But you need to be, you still need to provide updates to the sponsor because they are the ones who are funding it. They want to see that progress is made. When you write the SOW, one of the things that you should not, because it's not a work order, you should not guarantee particular results because research fundamentally is uncertain. We don't know what is going to come out of it. Obviously, there's an anticipation to get some intended results, but there's no guarantee. So when you're writing a SOW, you're providing a research plan with some certain intentions, but there's no guarantee to it. Now, with this background in mind, let's look at what actually goes into the SOW. What are the details that need to be written down? Can we move to the next slide? Okay, so here's some few, I would say, key terms that we need to think about. The first one is who is involved? What is the research? Where is the research going to be? When and how? So let's go through each one of them. The first one is who. Who are the different collaborators that are going to be involved? So one scenario is, for example, one particular lab at MIT is involved, and they're the only ones who are going to do the research work. Even though there's funding from the sponsoring company, there's no research being done over there. The other scenario is there might be 2 labs at MIT who will do the research work. And then, so one component is being done by one lab and the other component is being done by the second lab. The third scenario is where you might have also research being done at the sponsoring company's lab, and they might even have a research scientist visiting MIT for a certain amount of time. Even a fourth one is where you might have labs from different institutions being involved. Let's say, for example, MIT lab, and as well as an NGS lab, plus an industry lab also. So that's obviously going to be much bigger and much more involved, and the agreement is also going to be much more complicated. The next thing to consider is what is the research that's going to be done? What are the different components? If there are multiple parties involved, for example, what component is going to be done by what group? What are they bringing to the table in terms of the prior, let's say, IP? Because this is important both from the point of view of confidentiality and also the IP that's going to be generated in the future, how it's going to be allocated. Where is the research going to be done at? Is it going to be only one lab at MIT, or maybe the lab work is going to be done at MIT as well as the sponsored company's lab? Is there going to be joint IP? That's something that needs to be considered. And the other one is obviously the time frame along which the research can be done. When is it going to start? When is it going to end? What are the different milestones that you will have? And this is going to be important from the point of implementing the project and providing updates to the sponsor. Lastly, the one is the how. So what are the resources that's going to be involved? Maybe data from the sponsor company or even the client's company, even though the sponsor is only funds it, but the data comes from a third party altogether. So maybe there is also biological material depending on what the project is. So there are many aspects that come into the defining the statement of work. So these are the elements that would go into a well-defined statement of work, but there's additional information that we also ask for in order to prepare for drafting an agreement. Next slide, please. Oh, before that one. The other one is these items that we have listed over here, they do not go into SOW. Once they go into it, in some ways you are promising results, specific results. So, but we still need them for drafting agreement. And the first one is obviously the research outputs. What do you anticipate coming out of at the end of the research? Are you going to have publications? What kind of results will you have? Maybe a model, a simulation model, mathematical model, or something different. Do you anticipate inventions? In what areas? Do you anticipate software being written, which is copyright protection? Will have copyright protection. Do you anticipate AI models, or is this going to be open research? So in that case, we are thinking about basically how do you anticipate to be distributed afterward? And the last one is, let me go to the next one. So we also need to think about the confidential information that's provided by the sponsor or third party, because that needs to be protected during the implementation of the research project as well as afterward, and how that data is managed afterward. We also need to think about, for example, the third-party software. Is it going to be important for execution of the project? The third one is very important, but although it doesn't always happen, is the scope overlap with other research and sponsored projects. A lot of times the PIs over time build on a research idea, but it has many different components, and some components might be funded by, let's say, the US government, or maybe even an industry sponsor. The new component, new research that is being proposed, how does it overlap with the existing sponsored project? We need to understand and analyze the overlap and see if there are any complications involved, and what that is. And if there is, I would say, formidable complication, you might even have to reframe the SOW to begin with. And lastly, the other one is to think about the background IP that is already existing, and what that is, and whether that is going to be important for executing the proposed research. and what are the implications for it. For example, sometimes you can have a situation where the background IP is being negotiated for exclusive licensing. That can be complicated, and it might be a good idea to, for example, advise the PI or the researchers to maybe reframe the research so that we avoid that kind of situation. So basically, so the first is to summarize. The first is the SOW, developing a well-defined research work with all the different elements, so that makes the participants, collaborators very clear what the different components, as well as different resources that are going to go into it, as well as the research output and the different elements that go into the research project execution. With this, if you have questions, I can take it, or we can switch over to agreement. And Leah is going to talk about developing a customized agreement and the elements that go into it.
And just before we transition, there's a question. How do faculty and researchers get connected to OSAT support?
Well, great question. And I'm so glad that you asked me about this, because it sounds like we now have a new customer. So the answer is simple. Just send an email to us through email. So we have a general email address, OSAT, OSATT @mit.edu. It's our general intake email box. So one of the catalysts will reach out to you quickly. So in your email, if you can write down like some of the background of your potential engagement or just a general question, it would be great. And also, if this question is from a department or DLC administrator, the answer is also, well, we'll be happy to come to your department and have a presentation to introduce our team to your administrators and also faculty. So just let us know.
Thank you, Grace. And a note to our attendees that email address will appear again at the end of this presentation. So if you missed it just now, we will have it again in writing. And with that, Leah, over to you.
Okay, thank you.
Did I just skip one?
No, that's the right one. So I wanted to start off this section by pointing out, well, so this is agreement overview, but it ties into the statement of work section and what Subarna has just discussed, because I have three parts to discuss, but the overarching sort of point of this section is that OSAT is a team of professionals, specifically in my section, the Strategic Transactions Officer team is legal resource to develop a customized agreement. And that customized agreement can be done efficiently because of all the work that you've done with the catalysts, as Subarna described, developing that statement of work and thinking about what potential research outputs may come out of it and how the research fits with the IP portfolio, if there is one, so that we know going into drafting the agreement, sort of the parameters of what we're working with. The idea there is that you end up with an agreement that is, as we're saying, a customized agreement, but it's tailored to what the parties would expect to see in an agreement. And hopefully by doing that, we engage in a more efficient process, which the hope would be that it's more efficient and everyone's happier. So the work that you put into going through the questions with a catalyst and thinking about all of these things, it pays off when it comes over to the Strategic Transactions Officer to actually memorialize that in an agreement, and usually working with the legal side of the company. So when it gets to this point, we have a lot of agreements that we use, and basically, the one I wanted to talk mostly about today is a standard industry sponsored research agreement. So these are just basic terms that are covered by our agreements. Some of the things that are bolded to make the point, obviously, but we need to have named parties to the agreement. including any collaborators. Sometimes that's not just MIT and the company, but it could be another institution alongside the MIT faculty member, a subcontract perhaps. Identify the principal investigator, and of course, sponsor fit with MIT is important. All of the agreements include a timeline. They have a start and an end time. They have a budget amount, which is always approved through the DLC. We don't prefer, dare I say, to include a detailed budget as part of the agreement, but you still work through financial officer to make sure that what we have as the dollar amount for the agreement is accurate and So the statements of work, on the other hand, are attached, and that's an important thing to note. The agreements, will have a part about export control. They, always protect the researcher's right to publish results. And, the research compliance bullet here is really also referring to the role of OSAT catalysts and STO to connect the researchers and other administrators with the right resources in compliance space in VPR. But we are, well-versed in the research compliance elements as well, and we offer support in that area. The agreements always address intellectual property, as you would expect, and as has been raised. I didn't go into too much detail here because it's fact specific, and I just, we could spend a whole nother webinar on that one, or 5 on that topic. They always address the use of sponsor confidential information, materials, and data, and OSAT handles. So if the exchange of any of those items was not under an industry-sponsored research agreement, OSAT would also handle those agreements as standalone. So it's just to note that those requests can also come through OSAT. Always address use of name, risk management, and other legal matters. But that's the basic overview of what goes into a sponsored research agreement, and it's with the strategic transactions team alongside the catalyst to strategic transactions first to draft, and then along with the catalyst to negotiate the agreements with the sponsor. So, Michael, if you go to the next, you'll.
Okay. And Leah, as I do, there's a question that perhaps ties into this next slide. The question is, what part of the customized agreement is drafted by a catalyst and what by the STO?
Well, the STO has the primary responsibility for drafting. The catalyst is really working on, as Subarna discussed, the statement of work. So, yes. Okay, so in creating the customized agreement, STOs use all of this collected information from your conversations with Catalyst in order to draft that agreement and make it make sense and meet the parties' expectations early on. I alluded to this earlier, but we are hoping and we believe, or else we wouldn't be here, that leads to a more efficient process, because the first draft is responsive to what people are expecting to see, and then they can more quickly move through the approval process, either internally at the company and on our side as well. But when things are closer to where you expect them to be at the beginning, there's less distance to travel to get to agreement. So that's the idea. The sub points here are referring to where we know that a certain project is collaborative going into it, or that there are going to be data and materials exchanged, or there will be use of confidential information, limited or expanded rights, or other special terms. that helps tremendously to know that all in advance. If we find it out piecemeal as we go along, that can drag out the time spent in the negotiation and sort of serve to frustrate the process and frustrate the people in the process. So when we are creating that agreement, it's really built on all of this information that we've gathered leading up to that point. You can go to the next one. Thanks. So, and then, we create the agreement, and then of course we have to speak to the sponsor about it. We have conversations with them. We negotiate the agreement with the sponsor. The catalyst together with the STO are the primary points of contact for the negotiation. And we are not, we're not controlling the relationship between the scientist and the other scientific contacts. It's usually that the company's legal side will get involved at that point, and we will work out the agreement. So the PI and researchers maintain the scientific relationship throughout, which is a very important part of having a successful collaboration. So it's not a handoff where there's no further communication. Of course, that wouldn't be good. But just going about the negotiation itself, it's the catalyst and the STO, and then the catalyst updates the PIs and others as the process progresses and works with other, with RAS and others in compliance to make sure that everything is, all compliance items are taken care of before we sign the agreement, and that relieves the faculty member or other scientists of having to follow those compliance threads. That's where we step in and we can coordinate those pieces. So there's not a need for the PI to manage those particular interactions, which we think is providing good service. So I think actually, Michael, there's one more, I think, that's under STT, if you don't mind switching.
Sure. And Leah, there's a question that came in regarding confidential information, asking if you could talk a little bit more about when in the process a researcher might want to request an NDA or maybe an MTA, or maybe even, is it before the process? Is it in parallel with the process?
So if the faculty member is interested in pursuing an industry-sponsored research agreement, and there will be an exchange of confidential information or materials as part of that, those terms can go into the agreement. However, sometimes an NDA is signed in advance. If there is confidential information to be shared in advance to facilitate having the discussion about entering into an agreement, you might sign an NDA. An MTA, material transfer agreement, would be signed when materials would be going back and forth. That if it was a standalone, by standalone, I just mean the agreement is just regarding the materials. If that is if that was what the scope of work was, sharing those materials for a certain scope of work, it could possibly be done as a standalone agreement. But if it's part of a larger industry collaboration, it can be all put together. I hope that's responsive, but do follow up if there was a more specific angle that I missed. So the next bit here is just a list really of the research compliance requirements, and then how those connect to resources at MIT, and how the Catalyst and the STO connect you to those resources and support the interaction with them. So, export control restrictions. We have a team of experts in VPR for export control. just going down the list, I mean, International Coordinating Committee, conflict of interest, conflict of commitment, those questions are part of what the faculty member answers in KC, I believe, when the proposal goes in. And of course, Rupinder is a wonderful resource for those questions, and the rest. I won't go and read the list. I think this serves as a good guide, and I think the slides will be shared, and this is recorded anyway. But just to know that the Catalyst and the STO are thinking of these things and flagging them and connecting you with the right resources as we go. So that concludes the STO overview part. So Michael, a bit about Alliance Management.
Thank you, Leah. And before I do, Subarna, there's a question in the Q&A. Sponsors always want to know about expected results. How much detail can I provide on deliverables in the statement of work?
That's a good question, because I think in some ways it's a slippery slope, because if you start putting a lot of details, that also means that in some ways you're promising all of that. I think it's more about more like anticipated results, and I think that the main focus should be on the research activities that you will do. But obviously there has to be an aim for what activities you are doing.
Thank you. And Leah or Grace, did either of you want to add anything else to that, or are we?
I mean, I think Subarna answered well. I guess I would just add, there's no promise of particular outcomes. So as he said, the research plans are drafted with a particular endeavor in mind, but they're not written to say, and we will produce X, Y, and Z, or we will be able to do X, Y, and Z.
Thank you. And as a note for our attendees, my slide is the last slide. If you do have additional questions, if you'd like them to be answered during this live webinar, please enter them in the Q&A now, and we'll stay on to answer those questions. If you don't think of the question right now, but you think of it later, we will share again the email address to reach out to us. And please do continue to ask us your questions, whether it's during the webinar or whether it's in the days, weeks, and months to follow. OSAT isn't going anywhere, so we look forward to working with you and answering your questions. So on to Alliance Management. This is obviously what I do, so maybe it's my favorite slide, right? We like to think of our team. We have a small team, and MIT is very large. So how can we support so many faculty? And the answer is, in a way, we can't, but what we can do is we can help where we can be helpful. And we start by thinking about the institution level relationships. So as I said at the beginning of this webinar, there are companies that we work with that do a number of things with different faculty, different departments, all across MIT. So we can be a place that can help to coordinate those relationships, those communications, to make sure that that doesn't fall squarely on a single department or a single faculty member to resolve. We also want to be a knowledge resource. You might have an agreement, it doesn't matter how small it is, you might have a question about it. And your RAS contract administrator can be an excellent resource. Many of you have been reaching out to OSP for years. There might be someone that you know in a central office or in another department, and you know that they are just an expert. And so you reach out to them when you have a question. One of the reasons why OSAT was set up was so that you would also know that you could reach out to us, particularly when you have a question about your industry sponsored agreements. And if we don't have the answer, we're positioned so that we can try to help get you the answers that you need, get your faculty the answers they need to enable the research to continue. So we think of ourselves as the communications conduit, and it's really for that reason. Sometimes our agreements are very large, and that leads to the second bullet point, which is this interim program manager role. And if you've worked at MIT for a while, or at any university, or even at companies, you know that a large initiative gets announced. This big project is about to get started. And the situation at MIT is often, there's a great big signing ceremony and there's so much to do. and the job hasn't even been posted yet for the program manager who's going to help the faculty member do these things. And maybe it's 6 months before that person is hired and onboarded. The agreement shouldn't suffer or shouldn't have to be slowed down due to that lack of support. What an alliance manager can help to provide in some of these situations is that interim level of support to help you get started. And my colleagues and I can work with the lead PI on a project. We can work with the department to figure out what are some of the gaps that we can help fill while we're trying to get the project started until the program manager is able to come on board. And we can also help, if it's helpful, with the hiring process. So you can talk to us and we can work this out as your engagement is getting closer to being signed, as you're working with the Catalyst, you're working with the STO, you know that this is coming down the pipe. We're able to get involved with you early on to try to make sure that your launch goes as successfully as possible. And I throw a last bullet point for special projects, just because, again, as we all know, it's MIT, there's always something else, right? So when something comes up, sometimes we're asked as alliance managers to help lend a hand. And sometimes we're just, again, more like a knowledge resource, but someone that you can bounce an idea off of if there's something that you're trying to do. So we're always happy to have a conversation with you and try to figure out what's the best way forward. I see a question from our Q&A. And the question is, onboard permanent project manager. Will the PI need to build this into their budget? And my very selfish answer is, I sure hope they do. The reason why I say that so emphatically is because as we think about your agreement in steady state, we want your agreement not just to have a successful launch, but we want it to live on. We want the engagement that you have with a company to last for many years. We want it to be extended. We want it to be renewed. We want it to grow so that you have a source of sustainable research volume that you can rely upon to support your students and your researchers. The way that happens when you have a large engagement is to make sure that you have adequate support budgeted for your researchers and for the administrators that are necessary for the operational aspects. So we would always encourage sufficient budgeting. And the question about what is sufficient is something that a Catalyst would talk to you, whether you are a PI or maybe you're an administrative officer or a fiscal officer. We can have that conversation. The Catalyst can have that conversation with you to help figure out what is the right amount and how do you build that in and how do you communicate that with the company that might be resistant to paying what they see as another MIT salary. There are ways that we can help in explaining it to try to make that process more intelligible to them and try to make it more reasonable so that they'll accept it.
Michael, can I just jump into the add something to that question? I wanted to make sure that we were doing a good job delineating between one industry-sponsored research agreement project, like I was describing before, and a larger scale alliance, which may have multiple millions of dollars and 5 or 20 projects associated with it. So those ones that are larger umbrella agreements are generally the ones to get this project manager, or where we ask the company to budget in for an alliance manager, project manager, institute manager, that kind of job description. It wouldn't be that every single corporate sponsored research agreement, you need to budget for that role in every one of them. That's not what we were trying to communicate. So I just want to make sure we were clear.
Thank you, Leah. That's a very good point. When we're talking about a much larger engagement is the right time to have that type of conversation. So it's very helpful. So this brings us to our very last slide. And again, if you have questions, feel free to type them in. We can stay online for another minute. We do encourage you to reach out to us. Our general email is there. Again, information on us is here. It's fine if you want to email us directly, although we encourage you to go through the general email to make sure that it gets to the right people at the right time. As a last note, we've included at the bottom a reminder about the TLO IAP Intellectual Property Speaker Series, which we are a part of. We've put a link to that in the chat. And if any of you have any interest in the other topics, I definitely encourage you to attend. I've been to many myself over the years, and they are excellent. So with that, I see that we have no further open questions. So I believe